What if the pain you carry isn't even yours? What if the invisible weight you feel in your chest, the fear of not being enough, the inability to trust, or the constant chase for validation was never born in you, but handed down to you by someone who didn't know how to love you the way you needed? Your healing journey will always be incomplete until you look into the eyes of the very first man who shaped your identity, your father. This isn't about blame, it's about awareness. Because healing doesn't begin when you forgive, it begins when you understand. And until you understand your father, his silence, his anger, his absence, his pressure, you will stay stuck in a cycle that isn't even yours to carry. You may have outgrown your childhood home, but not the emotional wounds your father unknowingly left behind. And today, I want to break that chain. I want to help you finally see what you were too young to understand. I want to share 7 powerful truths about your father that will unlock the healing your heart has been craving. Please listen closely, because your peace might just depend on it. Number 1, he gave what he was taught, not what you deserved. And understanding this truth can crack open a doorway to healing that blame could never unlock. You see, many of us grow up believing our father is supposed to be a rock, a protector, a guide, a source of unconditional love and safety. But what if he never received those things himself? What if the only tools he had in his emotional toolbox were the ones handed down by a father who never hugged him, never said, "I'm proud of you," or who taught him that feelings were a weakness to be hidden, not a language to be spoken? You may have needed tenderness, but he was taught to offer toughness. You may have cried for connection, but he was trained to stay distant, to be a provider instead of being present. And so the cycle continued, not because he wanted to fail you, but because he didn't know another way. Most fathers are not cruel. They are simply untrained. They were raised in homes where discipline outweighed dialogue, where punishment was mistaken for parenting, and where emotional intelligence was a foreign concept. He may have yelled because that's what his father did. He may have withdrawn because he was taught that men don't cry, don't talk, and definitely don't show fear. And in your heart, you were a child craving to be seen and soothed. But he was a man stuck in survival mode, doing what he thought was right. This is not to excuse the pain, but to explain the pattern. Because healing begins when we see the story behind the behavior. Your father may never have had someone sit with him and say, "It's okay to feel. It's okay to be gentle." You didn't deserve that kind of love. You deserved warmth, safety, emotional presence. But his inability to give it says more about his wounds than your worth. When you stop expecting a man raised in emotional scarcity to give you emotional abundance, you begin to understand that his limits were not your lack. And from that place of understanding, you can stop repeating the pattern. You can become the one who learns a new language of love, who rewrites the narrative, who gives to yourself what you were never given. Because breaking generational cycles starts not with blame, but with awareness. And once you see that your father gave what he was taught, not what you needed, you gain the power to give yourself what you've been longing for all along: validation, safety, gentleness, and peace. Number 2, his absence wasn't always about you, and realizing that can free you from years, maybe decades of silent self-blame you didn't even know you were carrying. When a father is physically gone, emotionally distant, or inconsistently present, the child doesn't ask, "What happened to him?" They ask, "What's wrong with me?" That's how childhood psychology works. It turns absence into personal rejection, silence into assumed unworthiness. But here's the truth that's hard to accept, and even harder to unlearn. His distance was likely a reflection of his internal war, not a measurement of your value. Maybe he left because he was overwhelmed by responsibilities he never felt prepared to handle. Maybe he numbed himself in work, addiction, or silence because he didn't know how to sit with his own wounds, let alone nurture someone else's. Maybe he was there in body but absent in heart because he had never been shown what presence looked like. Some fathers walk away not because they don't love their children, but because they don't love themselves enough to stay and face the mirror that parenthood demands. Some disappear to avoid failure, fearing they'll mess up their kids the way they were once broken. And in trying to protect you from their flaws, they unknowingly caused a wound that no apology could fully stitch. You may have spent years wondering why he didn't call, why he didn't show up to your games, your birthdays, your victories, or why, when he was home, it felt like he wasn't really there. And without answers, your heart made up a painful story. I wasn't enough. But healing begins when you rewrite that story with the truth. It was never about your worth. It was about his capacity. He was operating from a limited emotional bandwidth, often rooted in trauma, shame, or an upbringing that taught him presence wasn't important, that emotions were liabilities, and that his value lay only in providing, not connecting. And once you see that, you begin to loosen the grip of resentment, not to let him off the hook, but to set yourself free from the lie that his absence defined you. You stop bleeding from a wound you never caused. You begin to realize that his silence wasn't proof of your unworthiness, it was proof of his struggle. And from that awareness comes transformation. The power to stop chasing unavailable people, to stop overperforming for love, to stop expecting closure from someone still running from themselves. His absence, whatever form it took, may have shaped you, but it does not have to define you. You get to fill in what was missing with self-worth, self-love, and self-presence. You get to become the parent you never had, not just to your future children, but to the child still inside of you, waiting to hear the words, "It wasn't your fault, you were always enough." Number 3. His expectations were his own unhealed shame. And the moment you realize that, you start to understand that the pressure he put on you was never really about you. It was about him trying to escape the parts of himself he couldn't accept. Though many of us grew up in households where the weight to be perfect, to succeed, to always win, to never cry, and to make the family proud felt suffocating, like love was conditional upon achievement, obedience, or appearance. But behind that pressure often lives a father carrying the quiet burden of his own failures, regrets, insecurities, and disappointments, many of which he never dared to speak aloud. Maybe your father was forced to grow up too soon, criticized for being weak, punished for falling short, or ridiculed for having dreams he never got to chase. Maybe he lived with the shadow of a father who shamed him, belittled him, or expected perfection without ever giving praise. That kind of upbringing creates a hidden wound, one that convinces a man that he must redeem himself through someone else's success. And so he looks to his child, you, to be the evidence that he didn't fail, to be the proof that he was a good man, a strong provider, a worthy human. But when a father ties his identity to your performance, he forgets to love you for who you are, and instead loves you for how well you fulfill the version of himself he wishes he could be. That's why he got angry when you failed, why he grew distant when you expressed vulnerability, or why he pushed you so hard even when you were already doing your best. He wasn't reacting to you, he was reacting to the unhealed boy inside of him, who was once made to feel that he wasn't enough. And so he placed that burden on your shoulders without even realizing it. But you were never meant to carry the emotional debt he inherited. You were meant to grow, to fall, to discover your own path, not live out a script written by his shame. The good news is, once you understand this, you stop confusing his disappointment with your identity. You stop chasing approval from someone who never fully approved of himself. You stop living as a mirror for his pain and start becoming a reflection of your truth. Healing means breaking the cycle of inherited shame and returning to your own authenticity, your own pace, your own definition of success and worth. You are not a project, a redemption story, or a trophy. You are a whole, complex, and worthy human being, not someone else's second chance. And once you understand that his expectations came from his unhealed shame, you can stop shrinking under their weight, reclaim your freedom, and finally say with clarity and courage, I was never here to fix you. I am here to be me. Number 4. He carried generational pain he never spoke about, and that silent burden shaped the way he loved, the way he lived, and the way he showed up, or didn't. For you, imagine for a moment that your father wasn't just a man, but a bridge between two eras, the hardened, silent world he came from, and the emotionally conscious world you're trying to step into. He didn't start the fire, he inherited it. Maybe his father beat him or never hugged him. Maybe his mother was emotionally unavailable or overwhelmed. Maybe he grew up in war, poverty, or under the weight of cultural expectations that demanded he be strong, quiet, obedient, and numb. So by the time he held you in his arms, he was already carrying a lifetime of pain he never had the tools to process. And like many men of his generation, he was told to man up, be a provider, never cry, and push through it. So that's exactly what he did. He pushed his feelings down, buried his wounds deep, and convinced himself that ignoring pain was the same as healing it. But what we don't heal, we hand down. And so he handed you not just his love, but his silence, his fears, his defensiveness, his emotional absence, and his inability to say, I'm hurting. You may have thought he didn't care, when in truth, he simply didn't know how to express it. You may have mistaken his short temper for cruelty, when it was really the frustration of a man who never learned to breathe through his anxiety. His anger may have scared you, but it might have been the only emotion he was ever allowed to express without being called weak. And his distant eyes may not have looked at you with softness. Not because he weren't worthy of love, but because he didn't know how to look at himself without shame. Generational pain is like a ghost, unseen but always present. It whispers through habits, reactions, and decisions. Your father may not have told you stories of what happened to him, but you lived inside the consequences. And understanding this doesn't erase the damage, but it creates room for compassion, not to excuse his behavior, but to break the pattern. Because if you don't name the pain, you unknowingly repeat it. But once you see it, you can choose to do differently. You can choose therapy, openness, vulnerability, softness, honesty. You can speak what he never could. You can process what he never dared to feel. You can begin the healing that he never had the chance or the permission to start. And in doing so, you honor him, not by becoming him, but by transforming the pain he carried in silence into wisdom you speak out loud. The chain of generational trauma doesn't end with understanding alone. It ends when someone like you decides the pain stops here. Number 5. He loved you, just not always in the language you understood. And once you realize that, a whole world of silent affection, misunderstood gestures, and buried emotion begins to unfold before your eyes, like a puzzle you never had the pieces to solve until now. As children, we crave love in very specific ways. We want to hear it spoken, feel it wrapped around us in hugs, see it show up in attention, affection, gentleness, and words like, "I'm proud of you," or "I see you." But what if your father was loving you the whole time, just in a dialect you weren't taught to recognize? What if every early morning at work, every broken back over bills, every oil change, every stern warning, and every silent presence in the room was his way of saying, "I love you," without ever using the words? You see, many men were raised in environments where emotions were seen as weakness, where love was shown through provision, protection, and practicality, not through vulnerability or emotional availability. Your father may have never been told, "I love you" himself, so he didn't know how to say it aloud. He may have thought that showing up, putting food on the table, or giving you advice about the real world was the same as hugging you or telling you he was proud. He may not have known that you were silently craving his warmth, not his warnings, his presence, not just his paycheck. And you, still growing, still learning, may have taken his coldness as indifference, or his discipline as rejection, when in fact, he was doing what he thought a good father was supposed to do: prepare you, protect you, and push you to survive. This disconnect between the love we need and the love we receive can create a painful gap, a loneliness that feels like abandonment, even when someone is standing right beside us. But when you finally begin to see that his love may have come wrapped in silence, duty, and sacrifice, instead of softness, empathy, or words, you stop measuring your worth by how much affection he gave, and start recognizing the effort he made in the only way he knew how. This isn't about excusing the emotional void or pretending that your needs weren't real. It's about translating love from a different generation, a different emotional vocabulary. It's about understanding that some men love with their hands, not their hearts, with their actions, not their voices. And once you learn to recognize those unfamiliar expressions of love, you may find that he wasn't absent, just unreadable. Healing begins when you stop expecting your father to speak your love language and start seeing the fluency he did have, even if it was quiet, incomplete, or clumsy. And from that place of understanding, you get to do something powerful. You get to speak the love you needed out loud, not only to yourself, but to others, breaking the emotional silence for good. Because even if he couldn't show it the way you needed, you were always loved. Even if it wasn't said, it was still there, waiting to be understood. Number 6. You don't need his apology to be free. And while that truth may sting at first, it's also the most liberating key you'll ever hold in your hands. So many of us walk through life with a hidden hope clutched deep in our hearts that one day he'll sit us down, look us in the eyes, and say all the words we've needed to hear. I'm sorry for not being there. I'm sorry for the pressure. I'm sorry I didn't know how to love you the way you needed. And yes, those words would be healing. But waiting for them, basing your freedom, your worth, your peace on whether or not he ever becomes emotionally fluent, is like locking your heart in a prison with no certainty of parole. Because the truth is, some fathers will never apologize. Not because they simply can't. They may not have the emotional tools, the courage, the self-awareness, or even the language to face the pain they've caused. Some carry so much shame that to admit they hurt you would mean confronting a mirror they've been avoiding their entire lives. And so they pretend, minimize, rewrite the past, or just stay silent. But here's the truth that heals. Their silence doesn't get to define your worth. Their inability to say, "I'm sorry," doesn't mean you weren't wronged, and it certainly doesn't mean you have to carry that wound forever. Forgiveness is not about them, it's about you. It's about finally putting down the weight that was never yours to carry. It's about realizing that you can validate your own pain, that you can grieve what you never got, and still choose to move forward without waiting for permission. You don't need closure from the one who broke you to begin healing. You can give yourself that closure by acknowledging the truth of what happened, by letting yourself feel the rage, the grief, the disappointment, and then choosing to let it go, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer controls you. When you stop waiting for him to admit what he did or didn't do, you reclaim your power. You take your story back into your own hands. And from that place of freedom, you get to redefine what peace looks like for you. Maybe it's writing a letter you never sent. Maybe it's crying in a letter you never sent. Maybe it's crying in a letter you never sent. Maybe it's crying in a letter you never sent. Maybe it's crying in a letter you never sent. Maybe it's crying in a letter you never sent. That hurt me. Maybe it's creating a life full of the love, softness, and presence you never received. Whatever your path looks like, it begins the moment you stop waiting for someone else's words and start listening to your own truth. You are not broken because he never said sorry. You are not less because he never owned his actions. You are whole because you are still here, healing, growing, and refusing to let the past be the final author of your story. His apology would be nice, yes, but your freedom never depended on it. Number 7. Healing begins when you redefine father on your own terms. Because the title itself, so heavy with expectation, longing, and often pain, does not have to remain fixed in the shape of the man who raised you or the one who wasn't there. For too long, you may have lived under the emotional shadow of what father was supposed to mean. Protector, provider, teacher, safe place, hero. And when the man who bore that title fell short, whether through absence, abuse, emotional distance, or even quiet failure, you are left not only grieving a person, but grieving an ideal. That's the wound so many people carry in silence. Not just the loss of what happened, but the loss of what should have happened. But here's the truth. The word father does not have to remain bound to your biological experience. You have the right and the power to redefine it in a way that brings healing instead of heartache. Maybe to you, father now means anyone who shows up consistently, who listens, who protects, who guides, who holds space with kindness and strength. Maybe it's a mentor, a teacher, a friend, or even the part of you that had to grow up early and carry the emotional weight your father never could. Redefining father and puts your father means releasing the lie that your value is tied to how he did or didn't love you. It means no longer waiting for him to become what you needed, and instead creating that foundation within yourself or through other healthy relationships. Healing is not always about reconciliation. It's about redefinition. It's about giving yourself permission to say, he wasn't who I needed, but I can still become whole. It's about choosing not to let the absence of a father figure define the limits of your self-worth or your capacity to love and be loved. You get to set the terms. You get to create the meaning. You get to say, fatherhood means safety, wisdom, presence, and love. And I will find those things, even if I must first become them for myself. This is the turning point where pain becomes purpose, where wounds become wisdom. Because the moment you stop expecting the past to rewrite itself, you start writing your own future. And in doing so, you free yourself from the grip of inherited emotional definitions. You step into a place of authorship where you no longer see yourself as fatherless, but as someone deeply worthy of healthy love, someone capable of building it, receiving it, and passing it on. Your healing does not depend on whether he changes. It begins the moment you do, the moment you stop letting his failures define your future. The moment you say, I decide what this word means to me now, that's when healing begins. Not in the return of a man, but in the rise of your own clarity, your own compassion, and your own voice declaring, this is what Father means to me now, and I will carry it forward with strength, peace, and purpose. In the end, healing from the pain your father caused, or the love he never knew how to give, doesn't come from blaming, hating, or endlessly waiting for him to change. It comes from understanding, from looking at his brokenness without making it your own, from seeing that the man you once called a hero or a ghost was shaped by wounds he never named and lessons he never questioned. And choosing not to carry that same silence forward. You do not heal by pretending it didn't hurt. You heal by facing it with honesty, grieving what was lost, and then releasing what no longer belongs to your soul. Let yourself cry for the child in you who needed more, and then rise for the adult in you who can now choose more. More love, more truth, more wholeness. Seek mentors, build boundaries, create your own definition of fatherhood, and remember, the most powerful legacy is not in what you inherited, but in what you refuse to pass on. And as you walk this sacred path of healing, may you be wrapped in divine strength. May your heart be softened by grace, and may your soul be guided by a love greater than the one you lost. May you find peace not in the apology that never came, but in the freedom of understanding, the clarity of self-worth, and the power of rewriting your story from a place of compassion. May God hold the child you once were, heal the adult you are becoming, and bless every step you take.